Welcome, everyone. I'm Kerry Schrantz on behalf of the School of Business and Wake Forest Executive Education. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We generate enormous amounts of data through the use of computers, cell phones, and other smart devices. Companies can use this data to better understand customers, track products, more effectively utilize resources, and increase productivity in the bottom line. The data analytics lifecycle impacts decision-making in areas such as marketing, financial forecasting, operations, and systems IT. Understanding descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive analytics capabilities allow us to take advantage of unforeseen opportunities and analyze risks critical to the vibrancy of most organizations. For the next 45 minutes or so, Dr. Jeff Campbell will offer a fresh look at the current trends in analytics, provide an overview of decision analytics, and close with perspectives on the certificate in analytics for analysts. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Everyone's audio has been muted. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them to me in the chat box on your Zoom control panel. Jeff will have time for questions at the end of the presentation, and he'll address as many as possible. Today's webinar will be recorded, a copy of which will be forwarded to you in the next few days. I'd also like to acknowledge and introduce my colleague, Whitney Strickler, who will be assisting in today's webinar and providing post-presentation follow-up. As mentioned a few moments ago, our presenter today is Dr. Jeff Campbell. Jeff is Associate Dean of the Business Analytics at the Wake Forest School of Business, where he leads the on-ground and online MSBA programs. His academic and scholarship focus are on the application of optimization modeling to difficult decision problems in a diverse set of areas, including operations planning and scheduling, supply chain optimization, product design, and conservation. Jeff is the co-author of 7 books on business statistics, management science, and business analytics, and his research has been featured in numerous academic journals. Outside of academia, he has led consulting engagements with the likes of Procter & Gamble, Owens Corning, GE, and Kroger. I'll now turn things over to Jeff.
Thanks, Kerry, and thanks, Whitney. Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you. And we're going to talk today a little bit about what I call decision analytics. And as Kerry mentioned, I'm going to start off with a little bit of a more general discussion of analytics before we dive into this particular area, which, as Kerry mentioned, is my area of research and consulting. And so with that, I'd like to start off with there are so many definitions out there of analytics. And analytics really has gone mainstream. When I first got out of graduate school, my PhD is actually in management science, which I would say today is just another term for analytics. But when I graduated from my PhD program, I spent a lot of time explaining to my relatives and friends what it is I actually do. And now that analytics has gone a little bit more mainstream, I have to do that less often than I used to have to do. So here's a definition. It's a broad definition, but it comes to us from a professional society called Informs. And it's their definition, which I like to use. Analytics is the scientific process of transforming data into insights for making better decisions. So some key words here are scientific, data, and decisions. And so we're gonna run with that, and we'll talk about the different types of analytics and prescriptive analytics in particular. A little bit about what's going on in the market. Obviously, we're still in the middle of a pandemic. There's a recession, unemployment is high. And this is a graph. If you look at the horizontal axis, it starts in January 2010, time series data, and runs to July 2020, last July. And this is number of new job postings in analytics. This data comes from a company called Burning Glass Technologies. And you can see there's this upward trend. Why do I choose January 2010? Well, it's been about 10 years ago, a little bit longer, since Tom Davenport wrote the book Competing on Analytics, which essentially started this revolution, this increase in the use of analytics. But you can see the steady increase there. There's a trend. And then I want to focus you a little bit to the right. when COVID hit, so look at January 2020, like most other sectors, most other job types, there was a huge drop. But what's amazing to me is how quickly and how pronounced the bounce back is. So it's almost like once you get into July, we didn't miss a beat. In fact, it looks like it's increasing demand for analytics in terms of measured by new job postings. Looks like it's increased. And that's not unusual. Historically, if you think about a recession, what happens is companies start to cut back, and they want to cut back or become more efficient in a smart way. And so actually the use of analytics increases in those situations. A little bit more data. This says spring, fall, spring. This is from LinkedIn Jobs. I searched on analytics and data science. Spring is a dark blue, fall is a light blue, and this is basically early September versus mid-January this year. That's what I mean by spring and fall. And you can see there's been an increase in LinkedIn postings as well. Sometimes people they wonder why there are more analytics jobs and data science jobs, since we hear so much about data science, but analytics is more of a general term, I would say, which is why we see more job postings. And when people ask me what's the difference between analytics and data science, I have a nice clean answer to that probably in reality is nowhere near as clean as my answer. But what I like to say is data science is data centric and analytics is problem centric. And problems are going to be what the focus of this talk is today. We're going to talk about modeling problems rather than say somebody handing you a big data set and saying, find that golden nugget that I don't know about in that data set. That's more of a data science kind of project. So we'll stick with analytics, and we're going to be problem focused. So when you talk to people about analytics, there's this categorization of analytics tools. So think about having this analytics toolkit, and we categorize the tools we have into these 3 buckets typically. Sometimes there are 4 buckets depending on who you're talking to. But we have descriptive analytics. Gave a seminar on that a few weeks ago. Descriptive analytics describes what has happened. So in that part of the toolkit, we have data queries, descriptive statistics, data visualization. Those are things that are in the descriptive analytics. Some data mining also falls into this category. Then predictive analytics takes past data and tries to either predict the future or forecast into the future, or figure out what the relationships are between variables of interest. And so there we have regression analysis, all the time series forecasting, some data mining, and a lot of machine learning is in that bucket, predictive analytics. And finally, there's prescriptive analytics, and you can see I crossed that out. Prescriptive sounds so hardcore, like, hey, you have to do this. And so I like to soften that a little bit and delineate the difference by using the term decision analytics. And that's a use of data that yields a course of action to follow. So it's different than descriptive and predictive in that when you solve a decision analytic model or a prescriptive model, you actually get a course of action back. That's not true of the first 2 types of descriptive and predictive analytics. And for example, you can forecast the demand for Pampers for the next quarter, but doesn't really tell you what to do. Now you can say, okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to develop a production schedule so we meet that forecasted demand. Now it's become more prescriptive. So we call that deployment. You can deploy a predictive model and make it a prescriptive model. So with that, I want to, and so we're going to stay in the bottom category here today. So we're going to talk about decision analytics and in particular optimization models. Now I want to say a little bit about data science. I published an article this summer with Tom Davenport in Sloan Management Review, and we looked at what was going on right now in data science and analytics, really, given the pandemic. And if you think about it, if you have some machine learning model, it's automatically being fed data, and then all of a sudden the data like drop off the map. I mean, you have a huge swing in data. Now, is the data that's being fed to that relevant for what's going forward or not? How much do you rely on pre-pandemic data versus pandemic data? All those kind of questions people are struggling with. And so what we've seen is a lot of companies have moved to descriptive analytics to do the prediction, actually. So what happened yesterday is what we're going to use to forecast what happens tomorrow. Simple kind of things. But the demand for prescriptive analytics is actually increasing. So with that, excuse me, I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about optimization. So a mathematical model of a decision problem can be developed, and then an algorithm can be applied to find an optimal solution to that mathematical model. Now, we're not going to spend any time at all on algorithms. Excuse me while I take a drink of my Coke so I don't have to cough and get a little sugar and caffeine in me. We're going to talk about modeling. And so how do you take a mess and essentially model it mathematically? We're not going to spend much time even on math. We're going to go straight to a spreadsheet. But how do you go from a mess, a decision problem that seems messy, model it in a spreadsheet, and try to arrive at a solution using the technology of optimization? And so how do we define a decision problem? In terms of math, we talk about, we have to have some objective. So what are we measuring? How do we know if we're successful or not? That's our objective. So it could be maximize profit, could be minimize cost, could be minimize downtime, maximize utilization of capacity, could be maximize hits to the web page. But there's some objective we have that we like to either minimize or maximize. That's how we think in terms of optimization. And then in almost every case, it's not a free for all. We have some rules of the game we have to follow. We call those constraints. And so I think when I think about optimization, and because I've been trained in this, I think this way all the time. What's my objective? How am I constrained? So what's the best I can do given the constraints? To map that to Excel solver, what we have here is a dialog box that lets you communicate these things to Excel. And so here what I have is the solver dialog box from Excel, and we have to communicate to Excel what these different pieces of an optimization model are. So it says, and I'll show you how to get to this, set the objective as a cell location, might be where my cost function is. Here, maybe it's profit. I can maximize or minimize. I have to tell the solver what I have control over, how much to produce in Q1, for example. Tell it the cell locations. And to put my constraints in, I have this window here. So this is called the solver dialog box. And we communicate to Excel. Think about doing a what if model. What's the objective? What are the constraints? What can solver control? That's what we're trying to get across. Now, what about use cases? So if you pick up an optimization book, you'll see some chapters on modeling, and there'll be a ton of applications. These are just use cases of optimization that I have personally done. So this is a very limited list, but I want to just run through some applications. So scheduling, any kind of scheduling problem can typically be modeled as an optimization problem. So sometimes I get friends, some kind of sports league, they'll email me, hey, can you build a schedule for us that has these characteristics? You can do that with optimization. Production scheduling is probably the biggest use in terms of manufacturing. Building diverse teams. So I have, for the last 5 years, used optimization to build student teams that work with clients so that those teams are as diverse as possible. So you can do that with optimization. I've done evaluation of the efficiency of US airports. Got a call from a newspaper and so they said they had this data. They wanted to know which airports in the United States are efficient. And so I used optimization to do a study for that newspaper to ascertain that. Probably the biggest application area I've been involved in is supply chain design. So that's an optimization problem. To give you an example of that, I have done work with, as Carrie mentioned, I've done work with Procter & Gamble. Back in the 90s, I helped them redesign their supply chain in North America. What does that problem look like? Which plants should be open or closed? Which products should be made at which plants? What should the capacities be at the plants? How many distribution centers should we have and where should they be located? And how do we service our customers from those distribution sites? All to minimize cost, but to ensure that we have the service levels we need. So that's a massive optimization problem. That particular project was very successful. We worked with a team of Procter & Gamble people, and bottom line, documented savings for the Security and Exchange Commission, documented for them over $250 million a year in North America by running the supply chain more efficiently. I've done work in carrier selection. So you send out a bid to carriers, you make pianos. You got to ship those pianos to where the demand is. You probably are not great at shipping, so you hire a third party. You want to hire third party carriers. The question is, given demand, you send out a call for bids. A lane is like Greensboro to Raleigh. And the carriers might be Schneider, other carriers bid on lanes. They know how much demand is going to be on that lane in the next year, roughly. And you choose a set of carriers so that you minimize cost in that bid process. I've done locating nature reserves to maximize biodiversity. I'm a runner. I've handicapped running races by age using optimization. I've worked with P&G in new product design and in product line management. So these are all different areas of optimization, different applications that I've worked on. The thing about optimization to a lot of people, it's like artificial intelligence. It can very easily be a black box. There's a lot of communication right now, a lot of discussion right now around explainable artificial intelligence. And the same is true for optimization. And I'm going to try to illustrate that with a couple of examples. But managers won't necessarily accept your solution from an optimization model if they don't understand it or if you don't sell it to them. And so I like this little cartoon. Let's say you want to, save $1 million. Just press this button here. We all know it's not that easy in the real world. So you have to understand the solutions you're generating. So here's a use case. It's actually a real example one of my professors worked on years ago. And I like to use it because it's small enough we can get our arms around it. It's a make versus buy decision. Rather than read this, I'll just tell you about it. And you can read along if you'd like. So Calhoun Mills makes fabrics. They have contracted demand for 15 different fabrics next quarter. And so they know what they have to make. They have two types of looms, Dobby looms and regular looms. They have actually 90 regular looms and 15 Dobby looms. So we know the capacity, and we have to make assumptions. By the way, when you make a model, you have to make a lot of assumptions. So we're going to make a lot of assumptions here. They think they don't have capacity to make everything in-house. They're not quite sure. And so the question is, which fabric should we make in-house and which should we buy outside if we have to buy outside? So we have a demands for 15 fabrics. We know how many Dobby looms, how many regular looms we have. So we have that capacity. And it turns out fabrics 1 through 4 cannot be made on a regular loom. So we have that restriction as well. So it's a make versus buy decision. Notice we're not getting into the weeds here. We're not saying which loom should we make which fabric on the third Tuesday of April. We're just trying to figure out how should we use our capacity? How much should be made inside? what needs to go outside and what should go outside if we don't have the capacity to make everything. And so this is my only slide with math on it today, coming up here, but I want to start in words. This is how I think about problems. What am I trying to decide? What's my metric of solution quality? And how am I restricted? So here, what am I trying to decide with Calhoun? How much of each fabric to produce in-house and how much to outsource? What's my metric? Cost. How am I restricted? I must meet demand. I cannot exceed the capacity of my looms, and fabrics 1 through 4 cannot be made on a regular loom. That's a statement of the problem I face. And I have the data to run this. So here's the math. And the only reason I'm showing the math is because it maps onto the spreadsheet. So you don't even, don't log off if this looks strange to you. I'm going to put it in words. So, but it's sometimes instructive to write the math because the math ports right over to the spreadsheet. So I want to minimize cost. There's inside cost and there's outside cost. And I know I have a limited number of regular loom hours, and I have a limited number of Dobby hours. I know I have to meet demand, and I meet demand one of 3 ways: from a regular loom, a Dobby loom, or outsource. And then I can't make the first 4 fabrics on a regular loom. So that's in words what this math says. And now I'm going to go out to a spreadsheet. And so hopefully you can see this. And I want to jump into this model a little bit. The first thing, when you're building a spreadsheet model, you ought to have a data section and then what I call a model section. Here I have all the data. So I have the demand for each fabric, 1 through 15. I have the production rate for a Dobby loom and a regular loom. And notice they're always the same when you can make it on either machine. I converted those to hours per yard. So I just took the reciprocal. So this is how many hours a yard of fabric 1 takes on a Dobby machine. Obviously, we don't have to carry all these decimals, but they're calculations. I have the inside cost and the outside cost. So I know how much it costs per yard to make each fabric inside. Doesn't matter which type of loom it is because the rates are the same. And I have a subcontract cost. I know how many hours I have available of Dobby loom and regular looms, and that has to do with how many of each loom I have and how much time's in a quarter. And so when I said I'm making assumptions, I'm going to assume, and this is a biggie, right? I'm going to assume that there's no changeover cost and that the looms never break. Okay, so I'm just going to assume we have all this time. I know it's conservative though, in terms of what might have to go outside. Let's see. I have an area down here that are going to be my decision cells. So when I solve this problem, the answer is going to come back to this gray box. And it's how much of each fabric to make on a Dobby loom, how much to make on a regular loom, how much to subcontract. Okay. And over here, I have some calculations. I calculate based on the cost above. I make the, is it a mill cost or a subcontract cost? I won't go into all the gory details here, but I will point out this in case you haven't seen this before. I need to calculate how many total Dobby hours, for example, that I'm going to use. And I don't know if you've seen this before. I'm going to come down a little bit so you can see this. Under formulas, there's an area in Excel called formula auditing. And I'm going to click trace precedence, and it's going to show you that how am I calculating the Dobby hours used. I'm taking this column over here where the answer is going to go, how much of each fabric I make on a Dobby. It's going to pair up with these hours per yard to give me total hours. So some product, what it does is pair up cell by cell, 2 columns of data, and adds them all up. So that's how we would calculate the hours used. And so let me try something here. I built this model. I'm not going through all the details in the interest of time, so I'm asking you to trust me that I built the math right. But to map it back right, I need total cost. I need how many Dobby hours and regular hours that I am using. I need to know the total provided so it can add up to the total demand. Now let me try something. I'm just going to do, whenever you have a model, you want to sort of test drive it before you do anything else. So if I was using this model just for like a what if model, I'm going to come down here and say, well, certainly one thing I can try is what if I just make everything in-house, or I'm sorry, outside. If I just subcontract everything. So I just took the demand from up top, dropped it into where I know the answer should be. So these gray cells are where I can enter values and have everything cost out. If I do that, I'm not using any capacity of my looms, and total cost is $762,975. So if a tornado hit our mill and took it out completely, this is what I have to do. So in a sense, I've given a worst case benchmark. So I ought to be able to do better than that. And I also want you to think about this model from a business point of view, right? If I run this model and the answer, what to do comes back here in the gray cells, and there's stuff going outside to be subcontracted, but I'm not using all of my loom time, I think I know something's wrong, because I'm going to allow fractions of yards to be made. If you go up top to the data, it's always more expensive to go outside. So if I run this thing and stuff is being sent outside and I haven't used up all my capacity, my business sense tells me that's not good. Something's wrong with the model. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to data, and in the data group, data tab in Excel, there's an analyze group. And so if I click on solver, this is that dialog box I was talking about. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to not run through all this, but I took that math and put it into this dialog box. So I said, you can click on this and say, where's the objective? The objective is right where I am, K45. I want to minimize total cost. So that's what I have here. The cells that I'm allowed to control are this gray box I've built. So I've highlighted that B30 through D44. M29 and M30 are less than or equal to B23, B24. Hours used are less than or equal to the hours available. Remember, the first 4 fabrics cannot be done on a regular loom, so I've locked those out. And in fact, I should just show you, when you add a constraint, you get this kind of dialog box. So all I did was highlight this, click on this, highlight it. Here you can do different things. I said equals, and then I typed in 0. So that's going to lock out the first 4 fabrics from regular. And then I have to make sure demand is exactly met. That's what this last set of constraints does. I have different options here. I'm going to use, this is linear, so I'm going to use simplex LP. This just makes sure I don't make negative amounts. Click that box, and I'm going to hit solve, and we should see an answer. That's good. This is what we hope for. Solver found a solution. So that quickly it optimized. This is the cost minimizing solution. So the lowest cost we can achieve is $599,108. And let's stress test this a little bit. I'm using all of my loom hours. Fabric 6 is going outside. It's subcontracted. Everything else is made in-house. Now we can clean this up. We can add new constraints that say these have to be integer valued, etc. This is a quick model. Do we have enough capacity? And if not, what should go out? I just answered that question. We don't have enough capacity to do everything. And fabric 6 is split, and some of it's subcontracted. Now going back to the black box idea, if I slap this down on the desk of a manager, the first thing the manager should ask is why fabric 6? I want to understand this answer. And if you think about what should get sent outside, it ought to be something where the penalty for going outside is small. So I should be able to take subcontract minus mill cost, find the smallest one, maybe that goes outside. Turns out that's not fabric 6. What's special about fabric 6 is it has the smallest penalty for going outside, but based on a loom hour basis. So if you think about it, what are the characteristics of what should get sent outside? A low penalty for getting sent outside cost-wise, but also that product gobbles up a bunch of loom time. That's what this metric shows. So you can explain to a manager by looking at the solution, doing a little bit of analysis, why this solution makes sense. Now it's not a black box anymore, or at least they understand the rationale for why Solver's coming back with this answer. So that's a production make versus buy example of Solver. I'm going to go to another example now that is also real. One of my colleagues did this. It is also a little bit dated, but one of my colleagues did this back in Ohio. So it was a long time ago, I forget, maybe like in the late 70s, the banking laws changed in the state of Ohio. And so the old law was if you had something called a principal place of business, which is think of it as a branch that also does things like check clearing. The old law said if I have a branch, or if I have a principal place of business in a county in Ohio, then I can put branches there. The law changed so that if you have one of those principal places of business in a county, now you can put branches in the county, in any county that shares a border with that county. And so what you see on the right is the impact of the new law. The blue county there is Hamilton County, where I used to work. And now if I put a principal place of business in Hamilton County, the yellow counties are now also fair game for my branches. And what the question was from this outside of the state bank to my colleague was this: what's the minimum number of principal places of business, and in which county should I place them so I can put branches anywhere I want to in Ohio? So operationally, which county should I shade blue so that I can put a branch in any county in Ohio? And that's an optimization problem. So I want to show you another example. Let me call up a file, and it has a lot of data. There are 88 counties in Ohio. And so this is a little bigger problem than the previous problem, but we're also going to use a very special type of variable, a binary variable. Binary variable triggers a yes/no decision. The data in this problem is also binary. So I'm going to zoom down here or zoom out to 10,000 feet. That whole matrix is 88 by 88. And what you see, these are ones and everything else is a zero. So that matrix has a zero in it if the row county I and county J do not share a border. And it has a one in the spot if the counties share a border. So for example, Williams County shares a border with Williams County itself, Defiance. If I go out further, Henry County, Fulton County. So this is a big matrix that will tell the model which counties share borders. And if I scroll down, there's also some data here on population we're not going to use, but if I scroll down, what I'm doing is I'm trying to figure out, should I put a principal place of business in one of these counties? How many counties is it going to take to cover the entire state so that I can put branches anywhere? So notice I made that gray again. So my gray cells here are similar to the cells that were in the Calhoun Mills problem, but they're going to be yes/no answers, 0-1 binary decisions. And here I'm calculating how many borders are shared essentially. So I have a calculation here, and I have this whole thing tied to a map. So what I'm going to do is let's think about the model. I want to minimize the number of counties that turn blue, because that's how many counties I have to put the principal places of business in. So that's what I've calculated here. It's the sum of the gray cells. And then here I've calculated again using a sum product function. I'm just calculating if a county has a PPB next to it or in it. That's what I'm calculating there. So this is a much bigger model, and these gray cells again they're zeros or ones. I'm going to show you how to do that. They're decisions that we make. Should I put a PPB in that county or not? Those are called binary decisions. they can make the problem harder to solve, but they're incredibly useful. So when I talked about supply chains before, a binary variable in that supply chain would be, should we have a Charmin plant in, I'll make this up, Greenwood, Mississippi or not? And what should its capacity be? Those are yes, no decisions. So I'm going to go back out to Solver again. And what I've done is I've created a different kind of constraint here. I want to show that to you. So this highlights the gray area. And I went to here and said equals, but instead of putting in more cells, I said they had to be binary. So I did that by selecting binary here. That says these values have to be zeros or ones. So now if I solve this problem, I should say, by the way, when I was in graduate school, this would run overnight on a mainframe and it just solved. So we've gotten a lot better with algorithms. Whoops. And I'm sorry, here we go. And it's mapped the solution. So here, what I have, the answer is it takes the minimum number of principal places of business is 15. And these blue areas are the counties in which we put a principal place of business. So you should not be able to find a county that's not touched by a blue county, because there are ones, you can see some are covered twice, some will share a border twice, but the important thing is here, everything's been covered at least once. So this is the solution to that problem, minimize the number of PPBs that it takes to cover all of Ohio. So now I want to go back to my slides and a little more recent and maybe much smaller problem. I'm on the data task force for COVID for Wake Forest University, where I'm a faculty member. And we meet multiple times a week now, and we're trying to figure out how to best mitigate, on the data side at least, COVID on campus. And so one of the problems we faced, we're doing stratified, what's called stratified sampling of students testing. So we have 5 buckets of students. They're different population sizes. So one might be fraternities, one might be off-campus students. So the buckets are 5 different populations. And we're going to sample in each one of those. And we have because of budget considerations, we have a fixed number of tests, 1,000 tests that we can do in a week. And what we want to do is find a solution that will allocate those tests to these 5 buckets of students so that we control the margin of error of the samples. So it's literally how many tests should we do for each bucket of the 1,000? How should we allocate those so that our margin of error is controlled within some limit that we set? So again, I'm going to go back out to my spreadsheet and let's not save this. And I'm going to go out and pull up another model. It's literally a model we used starting 2 weeks ago. And again, I mask all this. Some of the data might be sensitive at times, but we have these 5 buckets of students. We know the estimated spring population of those, how many are actually eligible for testing because some have already had COVID. And so what we're trying to do is figure out what percentage of each of these buckets we should sample so that our margin of error stays below, and this was set subjectively by the committee, 1.75%. So we're trying to allocate these 1,000 tests so that our margin of error for every bucket stays below 1.75. You can see some of them are not there right now. And this is an interesting problem because it uses a different solver. This is a nonlinear, a little bit of a tricky nonlinear problem because margin of error is a nonlinear function. And if I go to solver, you'll see that before, where I chose simplex LP, I've chosen evolutionary. This is a genetic algorithm that is used for more complicated problems. And I won't go through the details of all this in the interest of time, but I'm gonna hit solve. It's gonna start cranking. It'll probably take 40 seconds or so. So I'm gonna move it. I'm gonna maybe, let's see if it's close, because it's found 1,000. I want to hit 1,000, a sample size of 1,000 overall. But it's working hard, and it's doing a bunch of trial and error is what we mean by genetic algorithm. It's trying a lot of different solutions. There's a little bit of a probabilistic element to it. And it should finish up here momentarily. There we go. And you can set a time limit on this too, by the way. So solver, let me go back and grab that sheet. And what has it done? It's allocated the percentages. And you can see that the margin of error is now, in every case, we just barely made it for stratum D, but we are under 1.75. So here what we've done is an allocation problem. It's a small problem, but it's nonlinear, so it's a little more complicated. But solver has different types of algorithms to deal with different types of problems. So in terms of problem size, the standard, everybody, if you have Excel, you have solver. You might not have used it before, but you go to add-ins and you can add it. It's there. It'll take a problem of up to 200 decision variables and up to 100 constraints. But there's this thing called Open Solver, which is free actually. And you can go to this website, opensolver.org, download it. It becomes an add-in in your Excel, and then you're only really limited in problem size by your RAM on your computer. So you can essentially, for free, scale up the types of problems you can solve. You can also, the people who developed Solver for Excel is Frontline Solvers, and they sell something called Premium Solver. Has a lot of other functionality that you can actually purchase. So in summary, I was just giving you three quick examples. So make versus buy. Then we looked at locating branches of banks, essentially. And then applying this to COVID. How can we allocate our testing so that our margin of error is controlled under a threshold? There are a lot of other applications that I didn't mention in my previous slide because I haven't done them directly. But if you think about finance, for example, portfolio optimization in finance, that's an optimization problem, a nonlinear optimization problem. Capital budgeting is an optimization problem with binary variables. A lot of marketing, you mentioned product design and product line management. Those are optimization problems. The allocation of marketing effort, those are optimization problems. So optimization is used every day. It's become more and more important in logistics. There's a lot of discussion right now around supply chains and how actually an efficient supply chain developed probably with optimization sometimes can be risky given what happened with COVID. And so now there's a push around, well, can you build with optimization a resilient supply chain as opposed to the most cost-effective one? So a lot of discussion around stress testing now of supply chains, just like we talk about stress testing in banking. So with that, optimization is incredibly powerful, and this has been a very quick tour of some things you can do with Solver. So we talked about Solver, Open Solver. These things can all be accomplished if you're more of a data science person. This can all be done in R and Python. There are optimization solvers. In fact, the optimization engine in OpenSolver is the same that is in R and Python. But you can do all this in those coding languages. There are modeling languages that allow you to just express the problem mathematically and then load the data. Two examples are AMPLE and GAMS. I've used AMPLE for probably 20 years now in my supply chain consulting. So They just allow you to describe the problem mathematically, which is sometimes more efficient than going into a spreadsheet. So this, again, this has been a sort of a whirlwind tour of the decision analytics part of what will be a 3-course sequence in a certificate from our exec ed program here at Wake Forest. So I want to talk a little bit about it. So it's a 3-course sequence. There's a descriptive analytics, predictive analytics, and then what I just gave you a taste of, prescriptive analytics and optimization. And I'll go into a little bit more detail of each one of these, but part of that is if you decide up front, you take all 3 of these, you get a certificate. You can also take 1, 2 of the courses if that's what you choose to do. But the courses all bundled together result in a certificate with the provision that you have this sort of capstone project. So we hope that you come to the certificate with a business problem, and that what you learn in the certificate can address, at least help you address that problem. And so there's a write-up at the end that you submit. That's what we mean by this capstone project, a 1-page write-up of how would you apply what you're learning to that problem you came to the certificate with. So what's in these courses? We have descriptive analytics is going to talk about Power BI and how you describe and manage data, essentially in a spreadsheet environment, and how to tell a story around data. So everything we talked about before in terms of descriptive analytics, but very importantly, how to manage data, which is fundamental to the other types of analytics. Predictive analytics is taught by Dr. Balin, one of our full-time faculty. I should have mentioned Jordan Goldmeyer is who's teaching the descriptive analytics. He is sort of an internationally famous guy, world famous in Excel and Power BI. Tanya is on our faculty. She's going to talk to you about how do you forecast using time series data, regression analysis, perhaps some data mining, but all around how do you machine learning, how do you take data from the past, make sense of it, and use it in a predictive way. Tanya's done a lot of training in industry. She's been with us for 5 years now, I think. Teaches in our full-time master's program in analytics here at Wake. Then I'm going to cover the 3rd course, prescriptive analytics. By the way, each of these courses are 2 days, 8 to 12. 2 days in the same week, 8 to 12. I'm going to go into much more detail around what kind of different types of models. For example, I will go into detail about my model that I use to build diverse teams. That's a good example of something you can apply right away if you're in a management position and need to build teams. I'll go through the details of a supply chain optimization. I'll probably do some sports scheduling kind of applications. So we'll be doing a lot of different models, all in a spreadsheet environment for 4 hours, a lot of hands-on. So I'll give you a business problem. We'll work through it. You'll build your model, apply the optimization the way I have in the few examples I've done today, and we'll go from there. So, and we'll get into, I actually didn't show the details of a real nonlinear model, but I probably will go through something like the portfolio optimization in finance and that sort of application. So we'll also do some large enough models where we have to use OpenSolver. So we'll work some inside OpenSolver. And I can show that. I want to make sure you know that this solver is not so limiting. So when you add in, the nice thing about OpenSolver is when you add it in, it's free. You still always build everything in the plain old solver box. But you'll notice off to the right here, there's another panel. So when you go to solve, you just hit that solve button. So everything you learn about how to build a model, nothing changes. You just hit a different button at the end and you're able to solve bigger problems. It's very easy to use. So with that, Carrie, I think I've left about 10 minutes for questions I'm happy to take questions about what I've done in optimization. If somebody has a problem they think might fall into this category, I'm happy to answer questions about that or software. Ready for questions.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate the
Battery 80%.
Sorry, my battery went out.
yeah,
There we
okay.
go.
I was wondering who was jumping in there. We did get one question that relates to the last model that you showed. Isabel had asked, how do you determine the threshold, kind of the 1.75 for margin of error in the COVID task force example? I think you mentioned it was subjective, but I think she would like a little more background on how you came to that.
Yeah, so we have a data team that has a biostatistician who happens to be connected to Johns Hopkins. If you've been following the COVID, Johns Hopkins is kind of a leader in all the data. She happened to be working with people there. So the biostatistician and statistician and myself, and then some hardcore data retrieval kinds of folks are on the committee. And yeah, that was a subjective decision with that group and the larger group that includes university administrators. And so we really just kind of talked about what margin of error means and how tight did that have to be given the data we were seeing. But we did run different models to see how sensitive it was. And it turns out for this particular application, given the population sizes, if you set that margin of error too low, you get an infeasible problem. So there's a little bit of cat and mouse. So trial and error led us essentially to the 1.75 in that we try to drive it as low as we could, but recognizing that because of the way the buckets work, sometimes there's no feasible way to get the margin of error that low. So it was trial and error with some subjective judgment.
Thanks, Jeff. Another question. Can you talk about, and relate it in terms of your experience, but challenges you have faced in presenting data to senior leadership or clients that you have worked with? So as you run through these optimization models, kind of best practices as you present the outcome and the output from the modeling.
Yeah, great question. So that's one of the reasons I chose the Ohio banking problem is because it involved a map. And I've been lucky in that most of my consulting has been supply chain, so it's location based. And so using maps it's so intuitive to show a map for someone to show why an answer makes sense. So whenever you have anything involving geography, location problems, shipping problems, what I always do is develop a benchmark, show a map of what they're doing now or a map of the worst case, and then optimize, and then show the map next to it of an optimized system. People get it right away when you have geography. But in the absence of that, you do have to be creative. You always have to benchmark and find, it might be as simple as using bar charts to show, look, this is going to be the cost and the service level. If you do the same thing you did last year, here's what I'm recommending. You can compare the cost and the service level and then show them why there's a difference. You have to be creative in the use of tables and standard data visualization techniques like bar charts, like I said, maps, pie charts if they're not too bad. I'm not a big fan of pie charts. That's a different topic, but using visualization is the key and benchmarking is the key. So it's against something, what you're telling me might make sense, but tell me why it's better. Tell me why it's better. So you have to do your homework. When I think back across all my consulting projects, and again, I stayed mostly in the supply chain space, but I've done a lot of consulting for Fortune 500 companies in supply chain design. When I think back about what failed, one thing that is kind of a trap you could fall into if you have a client is they'll give you some data, but it's not complete yet. So you start to build a prototype model and they're still getting data for you. But then once they know you have a prototype model built, and they'll start asking you for answers, even though they haven't given you the data yet, all the data you need. And sometimes that doesn't go so well because things fall through the cracks and they start making decisions without all the data. So in my consulting experience, that's one area that I learned a lesson the hard way with a really well-known company. And I started giving them answers because they were asking for it before we were really finished with the model, and the whole thing went south. So anyway, hopefully that's helpful.
Good. Thanks, Jeff. We just had another question come in. Can you briefly talk about how analytics is used with other management tools like Lean or Six Sigma?
Yeah, great, great question. Let me start with Lean. I have done work with companies who specialize in Lean in logistics, and so analytics, you almost can't do Lean in logistics without analytics, right? So it involves things like optimal routing. Should you use a cross-dock or not? And making sure that it's lean but reliable. And so all of that, a lot of that, I shouldn't say all of that, that's a strong statement. A lot of that is driven by that kind of model, like the Calhoun model that I showed you, in that it's the optimal routing or optimal allocation of resources, where the objective might be as straightforward as minimize inventory cost, right? Or minimize inventory and labor cost. But again, what I mentioned at the start, lean and efficient can be risky when something breaks. By definition, when you optimize something, you're creating. Here's how I think about optimization sometimes. When you optimize, you're just figuring out what the right bottleneck should be. You always are going to have a bottleneck unless you have overcapacity everywhere. There's going to be some bottleneck in the process. And when you optimize, optimization figures out where's the smartest bottleneck, but that bottleneck is still there. And so I just wrote a piece on where I think analytics is going. I think managers are going to be asking for more resilient solutions as opposed to necessarily the leanest solution. So a lot of this is driven by the uncertainty of the pandemic. On Six Sigma, same kind of thing. Six Sigma, your objective could be a quality objective, right? It doesn't necessarily, maybe it's not minimize cost, it's to minimize defects. So analytics is heavily aligned, all the quality control and sampling, everything heavily aligned with Six Sigma and statistical quality control for sure. And again, you can think about, two people can sit down at a table, and one person's constraint is the other person's objective, right? Think about marketing versus or sales versus inventory. So you have a sales manager and an inventory manager. The inventory manager might be measured on the cost of inventory. So the inventory manager, she wants to drive the inventory as low as possible. The salesperson wants to promise everything to the customer and wants it there the next day. So they want inventory to be high. So somebody has to be a constraint and somebody has to be the objective, right? And management has to figure that out. So hopefully that was helpful.
Well, Jeff, we're at the top of the hour here. Thanks again for everything that you've shared with us today. One thing I did want to point out, Jeff, on the slide, we had a 10% early bird discount that showed ending on January 31. And I did want to reassure the group that's on this call that if you are interested in taking advantage of that certificate, we'd be happy to extend that early bird deadline for this group through next Thursday, February the 11th. As I mentioned, Whitney will be following up with you shortly, not only with the recording, with some additional information. So you can certainly respond back to that message. But again, for those of you who may not be aware, Wake Forest Executive Education does provide both open enrollment and programs customized for personal and professional development. The content that Jeff has shared and presented today is part of that broader certificate in analytics, and we'll be beginning on March 9 and 10 with descriptive analytics. And again, for those of you who may be interested, we will have the link to the program, recording of today's session provided to you most likely tomorrow, worst case on Monday morning. But again, thanks to everybody for joining. Thanks to everyone for joining us today, and please stay safe and healthy.